She refused to walk the aisle with a stranger until the mountain ranger offered his hand instead. The church doors were already open when they told her to walk. Benches were full. Boots lined the aisle. Faces leaned in. The sheriff stood near the front, hands folded, watching as if order itself depended on her feet moving forward. She did not move. She stood at the back with her hands locked tight, eyes fixed on the worn boards beneath her shoes. The man waiting at the altar shifted. He did not look at her. He looked at the sheriff. The sheriff cleared his throat and said this was finished. He said the town had decided. Murmurs passed through the crowd. Someone whispered that she was stubborn. Someone else said she was ungrateful. The preacher glanced between them and stayed quiet. She lifted her head. She said no. One word. Flat. It cut the room. The sheriff stepped closer. He said refusal would have consequences. He said she had no family left to stand for her. He said the town would not carry her weight. The man at the front smiled without warmth. The aisle felt longer. The crowd watched to see which way she would break. She did not cry. She did not plead. She stayed still. The sheriff gestured toward the aisle again. Two men at the side stood, not to help, to make space. Pressure closed in. She took one step back. A woman in the pew shook her head. A child asked a question and was hushed. The sheriff said this was not a request. He said walk or leave town by nightfall. Silence spread. Then a sound came from the side door. It opened. Cold air pushed in. A mountain ranger stepped inside. Snow dusted his coat. He stopped where everyone could see him. He took in the aisle. The sheriff. The man waiting. The woman standing alone. He did not speak at first. The room shifted. The sheriff frowned and asked who he was to interrupt. The ranger answered calmly. He said he was there because the road was blocked. He said he heard shouting. He said he would wait. He looked at the woman. He did not touch her. He did not smile. He held out his hand. Not to claim, not to pull, just open. The crowd leaned forward. The sheriff said this was not his business. The ranger said anything done in front of witnesses was everyone's business. The words landed. The aisle went quiet. The woman looked at the hand, then at the crowd. She did not move yet. But the balance had shifted. No one moved when the ranger's hand stayed open. The church felt smaller. The sheriff's jaw tightened. He said the man was out of place. He said this was a church matter and a town decision. The ranger lowered his hand but did not step away. He said he would not interfere. He said he would only stand. The sheriff scoffed. He turned to the woman and repeated the choice. Walk the aisle or leave town by nightfall. The words landed harder the second time. The crowd shifted. Some faces hardened. Some looked down. The man at the altar cleared his throat. He said the delay was embarrassing. He said she knew what was expected. The preacher finally spoke. He said the vows could wait. The sheriff cut him off. He said the vows would not wait. He said disorder would not be rewarded. The ranger watched the benches. He counted the exits. He counted the men standing near the doors. He counted the women gripping their shawls. The woman felt the weight of it all. She took a breath. She said she would not walk. The sheriff stepped closer. He said refusal meant hunger. It meant no work. It meant doors closed. He said the town had ways to teach gratitude. A murmur rippled. A man near the back said enough. Another told him to sit. The sheriff raised his voice. He asked if anyone would take responsibility for her if she refused. Silence answered. The ranger spoke then. One sentence. He said responsibility did not come from fear. It came from choice. The sheriff laughed. He said fine words did not feed mouths. He said the ranger would leave before this turned ugly. The ranger nodded once. He said he would leave after the choice was clear. The woman looked at the aisle again. It felt like a trap now. Every step would belong to someone else. She shook her head. The sheriff turned to the men by the door. He told them to be ready. The threat was plain. The ranger stepped half a pace forward, not toward the sheriff, toward the woman. He spoke quietly. He said she was not alone anymore. The words carried anyway. The crowd heard them. A woman in the second pew stood up. She said the girl had said no. Her voice shook but held. Another woman stood. She said forcing vows brought bad luck. The sheriff snapped that superstition would not rule. The ranger held his ground. He did not argue. He waited. The tension stretched until it hurt. The church waited with him. The first woman stayed on her feet. She did not sit when the sheriff looked at her. She held the edge of the pew and breathed through it. The second woman joined her. Then a man near the back stood. He removed his hat and kept it at his chest. The sound of benches scraping stopped. The church felt different now. The sheriff scanned the room. He counted quickly and did not like the number. He said this was turning into disorder. He said disorder would be answered. The men by the door shifted. One took a step forward. The ranger lifted his hand again. Not high, not sudden. Enough to be seen. He said no one needed to touch anyone today. He said the aisle would remain empty unless she chose it. The man at the altar protested. He said time was being wasted. He said his family would not be mocked. The preacher spoke again. He said vows taken under force were no vows at all. The sheriff snapped at him to stop. The woman at the back felt the room move around her. She felt seen and still exposed. She said nothing. She did not need to. The ranger turned his body slightly. He placed himself between her and the aisle. He did not block the view. He blocked the pressure. The sheriff accused him of provoking the crowd. The ranger said the crowd had already been provoked. He said he was only standing where the line was clear. The sheriff stepped closer. He lowered his voice. He warned that interference would be remembered. The ranger met his eyes. He said memory worked both ways. A murmur spread. The words traveled faster than the sheriff expected. A child's cough broke the sound. A woman shushed him. The church settled again. The sheriff turned to the woman. He asked her one last time. Walk the aisle. She lifted her head. She said no. The word did not shake. The sheriff exhaled. He looked to the men at the door. They did not move. One glanced at the women standing. Another looked at the ranger. The sheriff felt it slip. He announced the service was suspended. Gasps followed. He said the town would discuss her fate later. He said everyone should leave. The ranger spoke once more. He said discussion did not require threats. The sheriff ignored him. People began to stand. Coats were pulled on. Voices stayed low. The woman remained where she was. The ranger offered his hand again. Not as a promise, as a choice. She took it. The church watched. No one stopped them. Cold air hit them as the church doors opened. Sound spilled out behind them. Boots on wood. Low voices. The ranger led her only far enough to clear the steps. He let go at once. He did not keep her hand. People poured out in uneven lines. Some avoided looking at her. Some stared. The sheriff came last. He stood at the top step and said the service was done. He said the matter was not finished. He said the town would meet by sundown. He said she would answer then. The words followed them into the yard. A few men lingered near the hitch rail. They watched to see where she would go. She stood still. The ranger stood beside her. Not in front, not behind. Equal. A woman from the second pew approached. She offered a shawl. She did not speak. Another woman followed. She said the girl could sit by her stove until dark. A man shook his head and said this would bring trouble. The sheriff heard him and nodded. He said trouble already had a name. He said it would be handled. The ranger asked one question. He asked where the meeting would be held. The sheriff said the hall. He said everyone would be there. The ranger nodded once. He said he would be there too. The sheriff frowned. He said this did not concern him. The ranger said anything decided in public concerned those who stood in public. The yard quieted. The sheriff turned away. People began to drift. Some left quickly. Some stayed to watch. The woman felt the ground under her boots, solid. She breathed. The ranger asked if she had somewhere to wait. She nodded. She said the river road. He said he would walk part way. They moved off together. Snow squeaked underfoot. A child waved from a window and was pulled back. The woman did not look. She kept her eyes ahead. At the bend, the ranger stopped. He said he would return before sundown. He said the hall would be loud. He said she should not go alone. She thanked him once. He tipped his hat and turned back toward town. She watched him go until the crowd swallowed him. Then she continued on. The town watched from a distance. The choice had been made inside the church. The argument was just beginning. She did not go far. The river road bent away from town and dipped between cottonwoods. Snow lay thin under their branches. She stopped where the sound of the church bell could not reach. A small cabin sat back from the road. Smoke lifted slow and straight. The woman who had offered the shawl opened the door when she knocked. No questions, just space. Inside, heat settled her bones. She sat near the stove and watched her hands stop shaking. The hours passed in pieces. Wood added. Water warmed. Silence held. Outside, town voices carried now and then. Nothing clear, just tension moving on the air. By afternoon, people began to arrive at the hall. Boots on boards, wagons lining up. The sheriff wanted a crowd. He always did. The woman stayed put. She ate when the other woman set food in front of her. She drank. She waited. Near dusk, the ranger returned. Snow clung to his coat. He said the hall was filling. He said the sheriff planned to speak first. He said the man from the altar was there with his family. He said the benches would be full. She stood. Her knees felt steady. She said she would come. He said they would walk together. They left the cabin and followed the road back. Lights glowed ahead. Voices thickened. At the hall doors, the ranger stopped. He said he would not speak unless forced. He said standing was sometimes enough. She nodded. They went in. The room was packed. Faces turned at once. The sheriff stood near the front with papers in his hand. He began to talk about order, about duty, about what happened when people refused their place. The woman listened without moving. The ranger stood at her side. The sheriff saw him and paused. He recovered quickly. He said outsiders did not decide town matters. A murmur followed. The ranger did not answer. He stayed still. The sheriff turned to the woman. He said she would explain herself. She stepped forward. She said she would not marry a man she did not choose. The words landed clean. The hall shifted. Someone laughed. Someone hissed. The sheriff raised his voice. He asked who would take responsibility for her then. The ranger stepped half a pace forward. Not to speak. To be seen. The hall noticed. The waiting hours ended. The next choice would be made in full view. The sheriff waited for the noise to settle. It did not. He raised his hand higher and spoke over it. He said the town had customs. He said customs kept people fed and safe. He said refusal broke order. The man from the altar stood beside him. He said his name had been dragged through dirt. He said he had done nothing wrong. A few men nodded. A few did not. The woman stood straight. She did not argue. She did not apologize. She watched the room. Faces blurred together. Friends and strangers looked the same now. The sheriff asked again who would take responsibility for her if she refused. Silence answered at first. Then a voice came from the back. An older woman said she would. She said no girl should be marched into vows. The sheriff snapped that one offer was not enough. Another voice followed. A man said he had a spare room and no patience for threats. A murmur rose. The sheriff felt it slipping. He tightened his grip on the papers. He said the town would not be ruled by emotion. The ranger shifted his weight. He did not speak. He stood where everyone could see him. The sheriff pointed at him. He said the ranger was stirring trouble. He said the ranger would leave the hall. The ranger shook his head once. He said he would stay. He said nothing else. The hall reacted. Some shouted. Some told them to let it be. The woman stepped forward. She asked to speak. The sheriff hesitated. He nodded. She said she had worked in this town. She said she paid her way. She said she would keep doing so. She said marriage forced by fear was not order. It was theft. The word hit hard. The man from the altar cursed. The sheriff banged the table. He said enough. He said the meeting would vote. Hands rose, some slow, some fast. The count took time. The ranger watched the room change. The woman watched hands she knew lift against her. She also saw others rise in her favor. The sheriff finished counting. His mouth tightened. He announced the result. The town would not force the marriage. Gasps followed. Anger, too. The sheriff raised his voice again. He said refusal carried consequences. He said the ranger would leave town by morning. The ranger nodded. He said he would. He said the town had already answered the real question. The woman felt the weight lift. Not all of it. Enough to stand. The hall buzzed. People argued. The decision stood. The crowd had chosen once. It would choose again tomorrow. The hall did not clear quickly. People stayed in clusters, speaking in low, sharp tones. The sheriff folded his papers and said the meeting was over. He said order would be enforced at first light. The words were calm, but the meaning was not. The man who had waited at the altar pushed through the crowd and left. His jaw was tight. His family followed him out without a word. Several eyes stayed on the woman as she stood near the aisle. Some held anger. Some held relief. None held indifference. The ranger remained where he was until the benches emptied. He watched who lingered and who slipped away. Outside, the cold settled hard. Snow creaked under boots. The sheriff stepped onto the porch and called the ranger over. He said interference carried a price. He said the town did not forget men who challenged it in public. The ranger answered evenly. He said he would leave by morning. The sheriff nodded and said that would be wise. Then he turned to the woman. He said her refusal would have consequences as well. He said work would be scarce. He said doors would close. He said the town would not bend twice in one day. The ranger looked at him and said towns often changed more than they admitted. The sheriff did not reply. He went back inside. The woman stood still until the porch emptied. A woman from the hall approached her and offered a place to sleep. Another man said he would walk them home. No one shouted this time. The offers were quiet. They mattered more. The ranger walked with them through the dark streets. Lamps glowed behind curtains. Shapes moved inside houses. At the edge of town, he stopped. He said the night would stay calm. He said the morning might not. He said she should keep to daylight and witnesses. She thanked him once. He tipped his hat and turned toward the mountain road. Snow swallowed his steps. The woman continued on. The house she was given was small and warm. A blanket waited. She slept lightly, listening for trouble that did not come. Before dawn, Boots passed outside. Not many, just enough to be noticed. She rose and looked through the window. Men moved toward the hall. The town was preparing to test its choice. She dressed and stood straighter than she had the day before. Whatever came next would come in the open. The lines had been drawn. Silence would not protect anyone now. Morning pulled the town into the open, whether it wanted to come or not. The hall filled before the sun cleared the rooftops. Boots stamped cold from the floors. Breath showed in short bursts. The sheriff took his place at the front and waited for quiet. It came slower this time. The woman stood where she could be seen. Not hidden. Not alone. The seats around her were full. Some faces were set, some uncertain. The sheriff spoke about order. He spoke about precedent. He spoke about what happened when individuals thought themselves above custom. The words sounded practiced. They no longer sounded final. A man interrupted. He said the vote had been taken. He said the town had spoken. The sheriff raised his hand and said votes did not erase consequences. He said work was a privilege, shelter too. A murmur followed. The woman felt it shift. She stepped forward before being called. She said she would work. She said she always had. She said she would not trade her name for protection. The room reacted. Some scoffed, others nodded. The sheriff asked who would employ her then. Silence held for a breath. Then a rancher stood. He said he needed hands. He said he paid fair. Another man stood and said he had room in his stable until spring. A woman added that she could sew. The sound grew. Not loud, steady. The sheriff watched it build. He said this was disorder. Someone answered that it was choice. The word moved through the hall. Choice. The sheriff called for calm. He asked if anyone objected to her staying. A man near the door muttered that she would bring trouble. Another man answered that trouble had already been brought. The sheriff felt the ground shift under his feet. He changed tack. He said the ranger would still leave. The woman turned at the sound of boots at the door. The ranger stood there. He had returned at daylight, as promised. He did not speak. He stood where the sheriff could not ignore him. The sheriff tightened his mouth. He said the ranger was no longer welcome. The ranger nodded. He said he would leave after the town finished speaking. The sheriff turned back to the crowd. He asked if anyone wished to force the matter further. No one raised a hand. The pause stretched. It answered for them. The sheriff exhaled. He said the town would not compel the marriage. He said the woman would remain. He said work and shelter would not be denied on threat alone. The hall released a sound that was not cheering. Relief. The ranger stepped back. He had not been asked to stay. He had not asked to. The woman stood straighter. The decision had been made again. This time in daylight. This time with witnesses who could not pretend later. The crowd began to move. People spoke in low voices. Plans formed. The town adjusted. It would never say it out loud, but it had changed its shape. The hall did not empty when the decision was spoken. People stayed as if leaving too fast would look like regret. The sheriff gathered his papers but did not move. He stood and watched the room he no longer fully controlled. The woman remained where she was. She did not rush to thank anyone. She did not smile. She let the moment sit where it belonged. A rancher crossed the floor and spoke her name. He said work would start the next morning. A woman offered a spare room until wages came. Another said she would walk her there now. These were not promises made for show. They were practical. They mattered. The sheriff cleared his throat and said the meeting was finished. No one argued. No one applauded. People began to file out in small groups. Conversations stayed low. Outside, the street filled with movement. Daylight made faces clearer. Some looked at her directly now. Some nodded. Some could not meet her eyes. The man who had waited at the altar did not return. His family passed by without stopping. Their silence carried its own weight. The woman stepped outside. Cold air hit her cheeks. It felt clean. The ranger stood near the edge of the street. He had kept his word. He had come back to be seen. He did not approach her. He did not claim the outcome. The sheriff saw him and paused. He said the ranger would leave by nightfall. The ranger nodded. He said he would. He said towns remembered better when men left quietly. The sheriff did not answer. The woman walked a few steps toward the ranger and stopped. She thanked him. One sentence. No more. He tipped his hat. He said she had stood on her own. He said standing first changed everything. The crowd heard that too. A boy pointed and asked a question. His mother hushed him. The ranger turned toward the mountain road. Snow waited there. The woman watched him go until the distance took him. Then she turned back to the town. It felt smaller, not weaker. Smaller because the fear had less space now. She walked with the women who had offered shelter. Doors opened without being forced. A fire was lit. Food was set out. Outside, the sheriff walked the street alone. He had lost nothing he could name. He had lost something all the same. The town had seen itself in daylight. It would not unsee it. She did not leave town. She did not hide either. Morning came clean and cold, and she stepped into it with purpose. Work began early at the ranch by the river bend. Fences needed mending. Horses needed feed. Hands were short. She took the tasks given and did them well. People noticed without commenting. By midday, word had settled into fact. No one forced the marriage. No one chased her out. The sheriff passed once on the road and did not stop. He looked older. The hall stayed quiet that afternoon. No meeting was called. No correction announced. Silence did the work instead. By evening, neighbors came by with small things. A loaf left on the step. A pot set near the door. Nothing dramatic. Enough to say the town had decided how it would live with itself. She accepted without bowing. She thanked without debt. The days that followed took shape. Routine replaced tension. Eyes that once measured her now looked away or nodded once. The altar remained empty. The preacher spoke of choice the next Sunday and did not look at the sheriff when he did. A few people left early. Most stayed. Outside, the mountain road kept its line. The ranger did not return. He had kept his word. Some said he had crossed the ridge before nightfall. Others said he waited long enough to be sure the town would not turn back. No one knew for certain. His absence was clean. It asked nothing. The woman worked and slept and rose again. Her name stayed hers. It was spoken plainly, without warning, without condition. One afternoon, a girl from town walked beside her and asked how she had stood still in that church. The woman answered simply. She said she stopped walking because she was tired of being carried where she did not choose. The girl nodded and remembered it. At dusk, the bells rang for another service. The sound carried over the river. It did not pull at her. She kept her hands busy and her feet planted. The town went on. It was not healed. It was changed. Publicly. That mattered. When winter pressed harder, the work held. So did the choice. She did not owe the town gratitude. The town owed itself honesty. It had found a measure of it that day, not through speeches, not through force, through one refusal and one man who chose to stand without taking. What remained was simple. Dignity. Seen. Kept. And no longer easy to erase. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you had been standing in that church, would you have stepped forward or stayed silent like the rest?